Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. You're walking through the marble corridors of ancient Rome, the greatest empire the world has ever known. You hear the echo of sandals against stone, smell the incense burning in nearby temples, feel the Mediterranean sun warming your skin. Rome, city of philosophers, engineers, conquerors. But now, follow me down this particular corridor. Do you hear that sound? Running water, voices echoing off tile, laughter even. We're approaching something the history books gloss over. Something your teachers conveniently forgot to mention when they talked about Roman baths and aqueducts. We're about to enter a Roman public toilet, and I promise you, nothing in your modern experience has prepared you for what happened in these rooms. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you see one of history's most celebrated civilizations. Because while Rome built roads that still exist today, while they created law systems we still use, while they engineered aqueducts that were marvels of their time, they also developed bathroom practices so bizarre, so unsettling, so completely alien to our modern sensibilities that scholars actually hesitated to discuss them for centuries. This isn't just about toilets. This is about intimacy and shame, about class and power, about what humans are willing to accept as normal when everyone around them accepts it too. Have you ever stopped to think about how the most private moment of your day, that moment when you close the bathroom door and lock it behind you, shapes your entire sense of self? That privacy, that locked door, that solitude you take for granted didn't exist for Romans, not even for emperors. Especially not for emperors. And what they did instead, what they built, what they normalized, reveals something profound and disturbing about human nature itself. Let me tell you about the Forica. That's what Romans called their public toilets. Though the word doesn't quite capture the reality of what these places were. Picture a long room, maybe 30 feet across, sometimes much larger. The walls are decorated with frescoes, sometimes quite beautiful ones. There's a shallow channel running along the base of the walls with constantly flowing water, and then, arranged in a U shape or sometimes lining 3 walls of the room, there are bench-style seats made of marble or limestone, polished smooth by countless bodies. These seats are cut with keyhole-shaped holes, placed so close together that when you sat down, your thigh would touch the thigh of the person next to you, not occasionally, every single time. There was no privacy, no stalls, no doors, no partitions of any kind. When you use a Roman public toilet, you did so inches away from dozens of strangers, looking them in the face, continuing whatever conversation you've been having, conducting business deals, discussing philosophy, making jokes. The most intimate biological function humans perform, the one we instinctively hide even from our closest family members, Romans did in crowds, in public, while maintaining eye contact. Can you imagine it? Can you actually picture yourself sitting there, trying to relieve yourself while negotiating a contract with a stranger to your left, and making small talk with the acquaintance to your right? Your modern mind recoils, your sense of privacy, so deeply ingrained you probably never even think about it, screams in protest. But that discomfort you're feeling right now, that visceral wrongness, Romans didn't feel that, or at least they weren't supposed to. They had been socialized from childhood to see this as completely normal, to see privacy in the bathroom as strange, perhaps even suspicious. What are you hiding? Why do you need to be alone? Now here's where it gets stranger. Remember the channel of running water I mentioned, the one flowing along the base of the walls? That was it for waste removal. The holes in the benches dropped waste into a deeper channel beneath the seats that flushed it away. No, this shallow channel in front of the seats served a different purpose entirely. Romans didn't have toilet paper. They had something called a tersorium. And understanding this object is crucial to understanding just how different Roman bathroom culture was from anything you know. A tersorium was a wooden stick, about a foot or 2 long, with a natural sea sponge attached to one end. You would use the sponge to clean yourself after defecating. But here's the thing that makes your modern germophobic mind want to shut down completely. These sponges were communal, shared, public property. After you use the tersorium, you would rinse it in that shallow channel of running water. Then leave it there for the next person. The next person would pick it up, use it on themselves, rinse it, leave it for the person after them. All day long, every day. The same sponges, passed from stranger to stranger, intimate body part to intimate body part, with nothing but a quick rinse in between. Think about that for a moment. Really let it sink in. The same sponge that just touched the most private part of the person before you is now about to touch yours. And you know this. Everyone knows this. And it's fine. It's normal. It's just how things are done. The running water was supposed to keep the sponges clean, and maybe by Roman standards, it did. But we know now, with our understanding of bacteria and parasites and disease transmission, what was actually happening every time someone used one of those shared sponges. We'll get to that horror later. But for now, just sit with this reality. Communal but sponges were the standard for the most powerful civilization in the ancient world. Do you think you could do it? Do you think you could adjust if you had to? If you were transported back to ancient Rome tomorrow, if your survival depended on fitting in, could you overcome that screaming internal resistance and pick up the wet sponge that a stranger just used? Could you sit shoulder to shoulder with people you'd never met and carry on casual conversation while your bowels emptied? Or would something fundamental in you break? But we're just getting started, because the public toilets, as disturbing as they were, weren't even the worst of it. Let's talk about what happened in the private homes of Rome's elite. Let's talk about the slaves. Wealthy Romans had private toilets in their homes, of course. They were called latrinae, and they offered slightly more privacy than the public freak, though often not much. Many were located in small rooms off the kitchen or the atrium, sometimes with a door, sometimes without. But the crucial difference wasn't privacy. It was who cleaned them. In a wealthy Roman household, there was a specific category of slave whose job was to maintain the latrinae. They would clean the seats, manage the waste channels, ensure everything flowed properly. But they also served another function, one so degrading that ancient sources mention it only in passing, as if it were too obvious to explain in detail. Some scholars believe, and the evidence, fragmentary as it is, seems to support this, that certain slaves were required to warm the toilet seats for their masters. Let me say that again clearly, because it sounds like the kind of salacious myth that gets spread about ancient civilizations, the kind of thing someone made up to make Romans seem more decadent than they were. But multiple sources, including Seneca and other writers, reference this practice on cold mornings. Before the master or mistress of the house needed to use the latrine, a slave would sit on the cold marble seat until their body heat warmed it. Then they would vacate immediately before the owner arrived, leaving behind a warm seat, pre-warmed by another human being's buttocks, a human being who had no choice in the matter, a human being whose body heat, whose very flesh, was considered just another household amenity. Can you fathom the mindset required to use such a service? To walk into your bathroom and sit down on a seat still warm from your slave's body, knowing they sat there for the sole purpose of preventing you from experiencing a moment of cold discomfort. The intimacy of it is staggering. The dehumanization is complete. That slave wasn't warming an object for you. They were using their body, the most personal thing a human possesses, as a tool for your fleeting comfort. And this was considered normal, unremarkable, just how things were done in a civilized household. Now imagine being that slave. You wake up before dawn because your master prefers to move his bowels early in the morning. You walk to the latrine, still dark, still cold. You lower yourself onto the marble, feeling it freeze your skin. You sit there, naked flesh on stone, for 10 minutes, 15, 20, however long it takes. Your body rebels against the cold. Your muscles tense. You wait. You hear your master approaching. You stand quickly, not meeting his eyes, and leave the room so he can take your place on the seat you've warmed for him. And tomorrow, you'll do it again. And the day after that, 4 years, decades perhaps, until you reach old to be useful and they sell you to someone else or let you die. This is what Rome was. This is what their civilization, their law, their order made possible and normalized. But let's go deeper still, because we haven't yet confronted the single most disturbing element of Roman bathroom culture. We need to talk about what was actually happening in those public toilets. Beneath the surface of social normalcy, in the realm of biology and disease, modern archaeologists and medical historians have done something remarkable. They've excavated ancient Roman toilets. They've analyzed the archaeological remains of Roman sewers. They've examined fossilized feces from Roman sites, using techniques that can identify not just what Romans ate, but what parasites live in their guts. And what they've found is genuinely horrifying. Roman public toilets were disease factories. You see, the Romans were incredibly proud of their sanitation systems. Their aqueducts brought fresh water into cities. Their sewers, like the famous Cloaca Maxima in Rome itself, carried waste away. They built public baths where people could wash. They genuinely believed they were cleaner, more hygienic, more advanced than the barbarians beyond their borders. And in some ways, they were right. Having running water and waste removal was certainly better than nothing. But here's what they didn't understand. What they couldn't understand without microscopes and germ theory. Their public toilets, their communal baths, their shared sponges were perfect vectors for disease transmission. Recent studies of Roman era remains have found evidence of parasites that modern researchers didn't expect to find in such abundance. Whipworm, roundworm, and especially a parasite called Trichuris trichura were everywhere in Roman cities, far more prevalent than in Iron Age settlements that existed before Roman sanitation. Think about that. Their advanced sanitation made certain diseases worse, not better. How is that possible? The answer lies in those communal sponges and in the architecture of the toilets themselves. When you have dozens of people in a single room, all defecating into channels that flow into a common sewer, all using the same cleaning sponges, you create what's called a fecal-oral transmission pathway. Parasites and bacteria from one person's waste get onto the sponge. The sponge touches the next person's mucous membranes and skin. Those parasites find a new host. That person's waste contains the parasites. They get onto the sponge, and on, in a cycle that fed itself every single day. But it gets worse, much worse, because Romans didn't just use public toilets for defecation. They used them socially. People would spend hours in the Forica, especially in winter when the public baths were closed or too cold. The toilets were warm, kept temperate by the body heat of dozens of people and the constant flow of water that had been heated by passing through the high-cost heating systems. They became gathering places, social hubs, places where business was conducted, where gossip was shared, where people just hung out. Imagine a parasite's perspective for a moment. You raise a microscopic organism that reproduces in human intestines and needs to find new hosts to continue your species. You could rely on random chance, on contaminated food or water. Or you could end up in a Roman public toilet, where your host is literally sitting pressed against dozens of potential new hosts, where everyone is using the same cleaning implements, where people are spending hours in warm, moist conditions perfect for your survival. From a parasite's point of view, Roman public toilets were paradise, a perfectly designed system for spreading themselves through an entire population. And the evidence shows that's exactly what happened. Parasitic infection rates in Roman cities were staggeringly high, higher than in medieval cities, higher than in many developing countries today. The very infrastructure Romans were so proud of, the sanitation they thought made them superior to barbarians, was systematically infecting them with parasites. But here's the question that should haunt you. Did they know? Could they tell? Some parasites cause obvious symptoms: diarrhea, cramping, blood and stool, weight loss. But many parasitic infections are chronic and mild. You might have whipworms in your intestines for years and barely notice. You feel tired more often. Your stomach hurts sometimes. You're thinner than you should be. But you felt this way for so long that it just seems normal. Everyone else seems to feel about the same. Your doctor, if you're wealthy enough to have one, might give you some herbs or recommend certain foods, but he certainly doesn't know about intestinal parasites. Nobody does. So you keep going to the public toilets. You keep using the communal sponges. You keep pressing your skin against strangers' skin on those marble benches. And you keep reinfecting yourself over and over for your entire life. This is the hidden cost of Roman bathroom culture. Not just the indignity, not just the disease, but the silent, invisible suffering that nobody could name or understand. Can you imagine living with chronic parasitic infection and not even knowing that's what it was? Not knowing it was preventable. Not knowing that the very things your society told you were civilized and hygienic were making you sick. The particular parasites that plagued Romans tell us even more about their daily lives than you might expect. Take Amoeba histolytica, for instance. This microscopic organism causes what we now call amoebic dysentery. It creates ulcers in the intestinal wall, causes bloody diarrhea, and can spread to the liver, where it forms abscesses. Modern studies of skeletal remains from Roman sites show evidence of liver damage consistent with chronic amoebic infection and a surprisingly high percentage of individuals examined. These people lived their entire lives with this parasite eating away at their intestinal lining, with periodic flare-ups that would have left them cramping and bleeding and desperately weak. And here is what makes this particularly tragic. Amoebic dysentery spreads through the fecal oral route. You ingest microscopic amounts of infected feces, usually through contaminated water or food, or through touching contaminated surfaces and then touching your mouth. Now think about those communal sponges again. Think about dozens of people using the same sponge, rinsing it in water. That's flowing but not necessarily clean, leaving it for the next person, if even one person in that latrine had an active amoebic infection. The parasite would be all over that sponge within hours, and then every person who used that sponge for the rest of the day would be exposed. But it's not just the sponges. The architecture itself facilitated disease transmission in ways Romans couldn't have anticipated. Those beautiful marble seats, polished smooth by centuries of use, they were porous enough to harbor bacteria in microscopic crevices. The warm, moist environment of the latrine, so comfortable for the users, was also perfect for bacterial growth. Between uses, those seats didn't dry out, they stayed damp and warm. A perfect breeding ground for pathogens. And consider the splash factor. When waste dropped from the seats into the channel below, it would splash, not always dramatically, but enough to send tiny droplets into the air, onto the seats, onto people's skin and clothing. In a modern toilet, you're usually alone when this happens, and the bowl is designed to minimize splash. But in a Roman latrine, with dozens of people all defecating simultaneously into a common channel, the cumulative splash effect must have been significant. Microscopic particles of fecal matter would have been constantly airborne in these spaces, settling on every surface, being breathed in by everyone present. The scholarly research on this is genuinely disturbing. A study published in the journal Parasitology examined the prevalence of parasitic eggs in sediment samples from Roman-era latrines across the empire. The researchers found not just high concentrations of parasite eggs, but multiple species present in the same samples. This suggests that individuals were frequently infected with several different parasites simultaneously. Polyparasitism that would have compounded the health effects. Your body fighting off whipworms while also dealing with roundworms, while also trying to manage a chronic amoebic infection, would have left you perpetually weakened, more susceptible to other diseases, less able to fight off infections. Think about what this meant for life expectancy. We know that average Roman life expectancy was low, probably around 25 to 30 years at birth, though this is skewed by high infant mortality. But even adults who survived childhood didn't live as long as modern people. They died in their 40s and 50s, often from causes we can only guess at because ancient medical texts didn't have our diagnostic framework. How many of those deaths were hastened by chronic parasitic infections? How many people died of wasting disease or flux or simply old age, when what really killed them was decades of intestinal parasites sapping their strength and nutrition? And children, let's talk about what this meant for children. Roman children would have been introduced to public toilet culture early. There's evidence that children used the same facilities as adults, sitting on the same seats, using the same sponges. Some latrines might have had smaller seats for children, but many didn't. A small child would have been particularly vulnerable to parasitic infection. Their immune systems weren't fully developed. They would have been less able to maintain hygiene, more likely to put their hands in their mouths, more likely to make mistakes that led to infection. Skeletal remains of Roman children show evidence of growth stunting and malnutrition despite living in generally food-secure environments. This paradox puzzled researchers for years. How could children in wealthy Roman families, with access to plenty of food, show signs of chronic malnutrition? The answer appears to be parasites. When you have intestinal parasites, particularly multiple species, they compete with you for the nutrients you consume. They can cause malabsorption, where your intestines can't properly process food even when you eat enough. A well-fed Roman child could still be effectively starving because the parasites they picked up from using public toilets were stealing the nutrition from their food. Can you imagine watching your child waste away despite feeding them well, not understanding why they're small for their age, why they're always tired, why they get sick so easily, and all because you took them to use the facilities that everyone said were clean and civilized and proper? Now let me tell you about a discovery that changed how archaeologists think about Roman bathrooms. In the ruins of Ostia Antica, Rome's ancient port city, researchers excavated a particularly well-preserved public latrine. The building had clearly been a high-end facility, beautiful frescoes still visible on the walls, expensive marble seats, evidence of an elaborate heating system. This was not a cheap latrine for the poor. This was where wealthy merchants and ship captains would have done their business. In the waste channel beneath the seats, preserved in the anaerobic conditions that prevented complete decomposition, archaeologists found organic material, plant remains, food waste, and yes, fossilized feces. They subjected this material to every analytical technique available, and they found something unexpected, evidence of premium foods. Olive pits from expensive cultivated varieties, seeds from imported fruits, fish bones from species that would have been luxury items. The people using this latrine were eating very well, indeed, and they were absolutely riddled with parasites. The parasite egg count in these samples was astronomical. Multiple species of tapeworm, various types of roundworm, whipworm, and several species that the researchers couldn't immediately identify because they were now extinct or so rare, we have no modern comparison. These wealthy Romans, eating the best food available, living in comfortable homes, using this upscale latrine with its beautiful decorations and flowing water. They were as infected as the poorest laborers, maybe more so. Why more so? Because they could afford to eat out at public cook shops more often, giving them more exposure to food prepared in unsanitary conditions. Because they could afford to spend hours socializing in the public baths and latrines, giving them more exposure to infected individuals. Because they traveled more, picking up parasites from different regions and bringing them back to Rome. Wealth in Roman society didn't protect you from parasites. In some ways, it increased your exposure. This discovery forced scholars to reconsider their assumptions about the relationship between Roman sanitation and health. For years, the narrative had been that Rome's sophisticated water and sewage systems represented a genuine public health achievement, that Romans were healthier than their predecessors because of this infrastructure. But the evidence suggests otherwise. Yes, Roman sanitation prevented some diseases, probably reducing the incidence of cholera and other waterborne illnesses by providing clean drinking water through aqueducts, but it created ideal conditions for parasitic infections to spread, and those parasites may have caused more cumulative harm than the diseases prevented. It's a sobering lesson about unintended consequences. The The Romans genuinely tried to improve public health. They invested enormous resources in sanitation infrastructure. They created institutions to maintain these systems, and yet they ended up creating conditions that made certain health problems worse. They couldn't have known this. They lacked the scientific framework to understand disease transmission, but their ignorance didn't protect them from the consequences. Here is a question for you to consider. What modern sanitation practices might be causing hidden harms we can't yet detect? What are we doing right now with the best intentions that might turn out to be counterproductive or actively harmful? It's an uncomfortable question, but Roman bathroom culture demands we ask it. Let us shift focus for a moment and talk about the physical experience of using a Roman public toilet in more detail, because the reality was even more complex than I have described so far. First, the approach. Public latrines in Rome were located strategically throughout the city, often near public baths, forums, markets, anywhere people gathered. Some were standalone buildings, but many were incorporated into larger structures. The entrance would typically be open, just a doorway with no door, sometimes with steps leading down because many latrines were partially below street level. As you approached, you would hear the sound of running water and voices. You would smell it too, a mix of sewage, incense burned to mask the smell, and human bodies. You'd enter into the large room we discussed. But here's what I haven't mentioned yet. There was often an attendant, a slave or freedman, whose job was to maintain the facility and collect fees from users. Yes, you had to pay to use most public toilets in Rome. Not much a small coin, but enough that for the very poor, this was another expense they could barely afford. The attendant would take your money, maybe hand you a tersorium. If you didn't have your own, yes, some people carried their own personal but sponges which they would use and then take home to clean and direct you to an available seat. And here's where it gets interesting. There was an etiquette to Roman public toilets, an unwritten code of behavior that everyone was expected to follow. You didn't sit next to someone. If there was an empty seat with more space available, you greeted people you knew. You made polite small talk. If you were going to have a long, difficult bowel movement, you tried to position yourself away from the entrance where you'd be less noticeable. If you were just urinating quickly, you took a seat near the door so you could leave without disturbing others. Can you imagine learning these rules as a child? Your parents taking you to the latrine for the first time, teaching you where to sit, how to use the sponge, how to make conversation while defecating, how to rinse the sponge properly for the next person. This was part of being socialized into Roman culture. This was what separated civilized Romans from barbarians who, the Romans believed, just squatted in the woods like animals. The seats themselves deserve more description. They weren't just holes cut in a bench. They were carefully shaped, with a keyhole design, a larger circular opening at the back where you defecated, and a smaller opening at the front. That front opening served a specific purpose. It allowed you to reach through with your hand holding the tersorium to clean yourself. Think about the geometry of this for a moment. You're sitting on a marble seat with your buttocks over the large hole. You need to clean yourself. You reach your hand through the small front hole, holding the sponge on a stick, and reach back to wipe. This required a certain flexibility and coordination that not everyone possessed. For elderly people, for people with injuries or disabilities, using a Roman toilet must have been genuinely difficult. There's some evidence that attendants might help in such cases. But imagine the indignity of that. A stranger helping you clean yourself in a room full of other strangers. And yet this was normal, expected, just part of life if you were elderly or infirm and needed to use a public facility. The seats were spaced about a foot to 18 inches apart, center to center. This put the edges of the holes about 6 to 8 inches from each other. When you sat down, the person next to you was extremely close. Close enough that you could feel their body heat. Close enough that if either of you moves suddenly, you might bump into each other. Close enough that any conversation was automatically intimate, whether you wanted it to be or not, and conversations happened constantly. Business deals were made in latrines. Political alliances were formed. Gossip was shared. The Roman author Martial mentions in his epigrams that you could learn everything happening in Rome by spending a morning in the latrines near the Forum. Who was sleeping with whom, who was in debt, who was planning to run for office, who had fallen out of favor with the emperor. All of this was discussed openly by people sitting literally shoulder to shoulder on communal toilets. Think about the psychology of this. In our modern world, we're most guarded, most private, most protected when we're in the bathroom. We lock the door. We make sure we're alone. This is when we let down the social mask and just be animals for a moment. But Romans did the opposite. The bathroom was where they were most social, most public, most on display. You couldn't let down your guard. You had to maintain your social persona even in the most vulnerable physical position imaginable. What does this do to a person's psychology? How does it shape your sense of self when you never have a truly private moment? When even your bowel movements are subject to social scrutiny and performance? Some scholars argue that this actually made Romans more psychologically healthy in some ways. That our modern obsession with privacy creates neuroses and anxieties that Romans didn't have. That by treating bodily functions as normal and unremarkable, Romans avoided the shame and disgust that we attach to them. There might be something to this. Romans certainly seem to have been less squeamish about bodily functions than modern people are. But other scholars point out that the lack of privacy also meant a lack of refuge. Everyone in Rome lived in a fishbowl, constantly observed, constantly performing. Even emperors, who theoretically had the most power and freedom, were never truly alone. They were surrounded by servants, advisors, guards, hangers-on. When the emperor needed to use the toilet, there were people present. His privacy, such as it was, came not from being alone, but from being so powerful that people averted their eyes in his presence. Actually, let's talk about emperors and their bathroom habits specifically, because what we know about how Rome's rulers dealt with their bodily functions reveals the extremes of Roman bathroom culture. The Emperor Vespasian, who ruled from 69 to 79 CE, was famous for being practical and unpretentious. He came from a relatively humble background and never forgot it, even after becoming emperor. There's a famous story about him dying. His last words were reportedly, "Puto deus fio, oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." This was a joke about the Roman practice of deifying dead emperors. Even in his final moments, Vespasian maintained his sense of humor about the absurdities of imperial power. But before that final moment, Vespasian did something that scandalized the Roman elite. He tried to stand up during his final illness. His doctors and attendants insisted he stay in bed, but he refused, saying an emperor ought to die on his feet. He actually managed to stand up, and that's when he died, still trying to maintain dignity even as his body failed him. But here's what's relevant to our discussion. During his final illness, Vespasian had severe diarrhea. He was bedridden, unable to control his bowels, and he was surrounded by people, doctors, family members, advisors, all witnessing his body's breakdown. This was the emperor, the most powerful man in the known world, and he died literally shitting himself in front of an audience. There was no privacy even for that. No dignity in the modern sense. Just the human body failing while other humans watched and tried to help. Other emperors dealt with toilet matters in ways that reflected their personalities. Nero, infamous for his excesses and cruelty, reportedly had a latrine made of solid gold. Multiple sources mention this, though none survive, and we don't know exactly what a golden latrine meant. Was it just a gold-plated seat? An entire toilet facility decorated in gold? A chamber pot made of solid gold? Whatever it was remarkable enough that people talked about it, and it fit with Nero's image as someone who lived in absurd luxury. But even Nero's golden toilet wouldn't have protected him from parasites. Gold doesn't kill bacteria. A gold seat would still harbor pathogens in its microscopic crevices, would still be warmed by slave bodies, would still be part of a waste system that bred disease. All that gold bought was status and display. It didn't buy health. The Emperor Elagabalus, who ruled briefly in the early 3rd century CE, allegedly never used the same toilet seat twice. He would have new marble seats installed constantly, using each one once and then having it removed. Whether this is true or exaggerated propaganda from his enemies, Elagabalus was one of Rome's most controversial emperors is unclear. But the story persisted because it said something about Roman attitudes toward toilets and luxury. Having a new toilet seat for every use was seen as the height of wasteful decadence, something only a truly depraved emperor would do. But think about it from a modern perspective. Elagabalus, if this story is true, was actually practicing better hygiene than his predecessors. A new seat for every use would mean no buildup of bacteria, no transmission of parasites from one use to the next. What Romans saw as ridiculous excess might have been accidentally good disease prevention. Of course, it was also incredibly wasteful and a demonstration of power only someone with unlimited resources could throw away marble toilet seats, but the health benefits would have been real, even if unintentional. There's a broader point here about how we interpret Roman bathroom practices. What looks like excess or decadence or barbarism to us might have served functions we don't immediately recognize, and what looks civilized and advanced to Romans might have been actively harmful. We're separated from them not just by time, but by entirely different frameworks for understanding health, cleanliness, and bodily functions. Now let us discuss something that ancient sources mention, but that makes modern readers deeply uncomfortable: the use of urine in Roman daily life beyond just the street corner collection jars I mentioned earlier. Urine wasn't just valuable to fullers for cleaning cloth. It was used in a staggering variety of ways throughout Roman society. Doctors used it as a medicine, both applied topically and sometimes taken internally. The physician Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, lists dozens of uses for human urine in treating various ailments. He claims it can cure wounds, prevent infection, treat gout, help with earaches, and even cure certain types of madness when applied to the head. Was any of this effective? Probably not in the ways Pliny thought. Urine is sterile when it leaves a healthy body, and the ammonia content might have had some antiseptic properties when fresh. But the idea that drinking aged urine could cure internal ailments is medical nonsense. Still, Romans believed it. Upper-class Romans who could afford physicians might have been prescribed urine-based treatments. They would have paid good money for medicine that was literally piss. But the biggest use of urine was in the fulling industry, and understanding this industry is crucial to grasping how deeply bathroom products were integrated into Roman economic life. Fulling was the process of cleaning and thickening wool cloth to make it suitable for use. The cloth would be soaked in a mixture of water and urine, then trampled by workers who would stamp on it for hours in large vats. The ammonia in the urine would help break down the lanolin in the wool and clean out impurities. This meant that fullers needed enormous quantities of urine. A single fullery workshop might go through hundreds of gallons a day. Where did it all come from? Those public urinals on street corners, primarily, but also from direct collection. Some fullers placed large jars outside their workshops with signs encouraging passersby to urinate in them. People would relieve themselves into these jars as a public service. The fuller would collect the jars when full, and grateful citizens would have helped meet their need while also not having to find a public latrine. The Emperor Vespasian, who we mentioned earlier, saw an opportunity here. He placed a tax on urine collection. The fullers had to pay the state for the privilege of collecting human piss from public urinals. This seemed absurd to many Romans taxing urine, but Vespasian's logic was sound. It was a valuable commodity being collected from public facilities. Why shouldn't the state get a cut? His son Titus objected, finding the whole thing unseemly. That is when Vespasian supposedly held up a gold coin and said pecunia non olet. Money doesn't smell. The phrase has become famous, often quoted in discussions of economic morality. But think about what it really means. The Emperor of Rome was defending his right to tax piss, and his defense was essentially that money is money regardless of its source. This tells us something profound about Roman attitudes toward bodily waste. It was simultaneously seen as disgusting and as a valuable resource. The same urine that was too filthy to touch bare-handed was also worth collecting, worth transporting across the city, worth taxing, worth using in industry and medicine. Romans had a complicated, multifaceted relationship with their waste that doesn't map neatly onto our modern categories of clean and unclean. And this brings us to another uncomfortable topic. What Romans did with solid waste. Where did all that feces go after it left the latrines? The waste channels beneath the toilet seats flowed into the sewers, as I mentioned. But sewers weren't closed pipes like modern sewage systems. They were more like underground rivers, open channels, sometimes quite large, that carried waste by gravity flow toward outlets. In Rome, most sewers eventually emptied into the Tiber River. In other cities, they might empty into local rivers, into the sea, or into designated waste pits outside the city walls. This means that a significant portion of Rome's waste ended up in the Tiber, which flowed through the heart of the city. The river must have been appallingly polluted, especially downstream from the main sewer outlets. Fish caught in the Tiber would have been swimming in diluted sewage. People who bathe in the river, and people did, especially those too poor to afford the public baths, were bathing in contaminated water. Anyone who fell into the Tiber had a decent chance of getting seriously ill from the exposure. But Romans didn't make the connection between contaminated water and disease. They couldn't. The germ theory of disease wouldn't be discovered for another 1800 years. So they kept using the river, kept eating fish from it, kept treating it as a natural resource rather than a sewage ditch. Some waste didn't make it to the sewers at all, despite laws against it. People regularly dumped chamber pots out windows or into alleys. In the dense insulae of Rome, where hundreds of people might live in a single building, the accumulation of this illegally dumped waste must have been significant. The city employed workers to clean the streets, but they fought a losing battle against the sheer volume of waste being produced. And then there was intentional waste collection for agriculture. Human feces, like animal manure, can be used as fertilizer. It's actually an excellent fertilizer when properly composted, rich in nitrogen and other nutrients plants need. Romans knew this. Farmers near cities would sometimes pay for the right to collect human waste from public latrines and take it to their fields. This created a bizarre economic relationship, the same ways that people paid to deposit in public toilets. Remember, most charged a small fee could then be sold to farmers as fertilizer. The waste itself had negative value when inside your body, making you pay to get rid of it. But positive value once collected in sufficient quantity, valuable enough that farmers would pay for it. However, using human waste as fertilizer has risks that Romans didn't understand. Urine wasn't just valuable to fullers for cleaning cloth. It was used in a staggering variety of ways throughout Roman society. Doctors used it as a medicine, both applied topically and sometimes taken internally. The physician Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, lists dozens of uses for human urine in treating various ailments. He claims it can cure wounds, prevent infection, treat gout, help with earaches, and even cure certain types of madness when applied to the head. Was any of this effective? Probably not in the ways Pliny thought. Urine is sterile when it leaves a healthy body, and the ammonia content might have had some antiseptic properties when fresh. But the idea that drinking aged urine could cure internal ailments is medical nonsense. Still, Romans believed it. Upper-class Romans who could afford physicians might have been prescribed urine-based treatments. They would have paid good money for medicine that was literally piss. But the biggest use of urine was in the fulling industry, and understanding this industry is crucial to grasping how deeply bathroom products were integrated into Roman economic life. Fulling was the process of cleaning and thickening wool cloth to make it suitable for use. The cloth would be soaked in a mixture of water and urine, then trampled by workers who would stamp on it for hours in large vats. The ammonia in the urine would help break down the lanolin in the wool and clean out impurities. This meant that fullers needed enormous quantities of urine. A single fullery workshop might go through hundreds of gallons a day. Where did it all come from? those public urinals on street corners, primarily, but also from direct collection. Some fullers place large jars outside their workshops with signs encouraging passersby to urinate in them. People would relieve themselves into these jars as a public service. The fuller would collect the jars when full, and grateful citizens would have helped meet their need while also not having to find a public latrine. The Emperor Vespasian, who we mentioned earlier, saw an opportunity here. He placed a tax on urine collection. The fullers had to pay the state for the privilege of collecting human piss from public urinals. This seemed absurd to many Romans taxing urine, but Vespasian's logic was sound. It was a valuable commodity being collected from public facilities. Why shouldn't the state get a cut? His son Titus objected, finding the whole thing unseemly. That is when Vespasian supposedly held up a gold coin and said pecunia non olet. Money doesn't smell. The phrase has become famous, often quoted in discussions of economic morality. But think about what it really means. The Emperor of Rome was defending his right to tax piss, and his defense was essentially that money is money regardless of its source. This tells us something profound about Roman attitudes toward bodily waste. It was simultaneously seen as disgusting and as a valuable resource. The same urine that was too filthy to touch barehanded was also worth collecting, worth transporting across the city, worth taxing, worth using in industry and medicine. Romans had a complicated, multifaceted relationship with their waste that doesn't map neatly onto our modern categories of clean and unclean. And this brings us to another uncomfortable topic. What Romans did with solid waste. Where did all that feces go after it left the latrines? The waste channels beneath the toilet seats flowed into the sewers, as I mentioned. But sewers weren't closed pipes like modern sewage systems. They were more like underground rivers, open channels, sometimes quite large, that carried waste by gravity flow toward outlets. In Rome, most sewers eventually emptied into the Tiber River. In other cities, they might empty into local rivers, into the sea, or into designated waste pits outside the city walls. This means that a significant portion of Rome's waste ended up in the Tiber, which flowed through the heart of the city. The river must have been appallingly polluted, especially downstream from the main sewer outlets. Fish caught in the Tiber would have been swimming in diluted sewage. People who bathed in the river, and people did, especially those too poor to afford the public baths, were bathing in contaminated water. Anyone who fell into the Tiber had a decent chance of getting seriously ill from the exposure. But Romans didn't make the connection between contaminated water and disease. They couldn't. The germ theory of disease wouldn't be discovered for another 1800 years. So they kept using the river, kept eating fish from it, kept treating it as a natural resource rather than a sewage ditch. Some waste didn't make it to the sewers at all, despite laws against it. People regularly dumped chamber pots out windows or into alleys. In the dense insulae of Rome, where hundreds of people might live in a single building, the accumulation of this illegally dumped waste must have been significant. The city employed workers to clean the streets, but they fought a losing battle against the sheer volume of waste being produced. And then there was intentional waste collection for agriculture. Human feces, like animal manure, can be used as fertilizer. It's actually an excellent fertilizer when properly composted, rich in nitrogen and other nutrients plants need. Romans knew this. Farmers near cities would sometimes pay for the right to collect human waste from public latrines and take it to their fields. This created a bizarre economic relationship, the same ways that people paid to deposit in public toilets, remember. Most charged a small fee, could then be sold to farmers as fertilizer. The waste itself had negative value when inside your body, making you pay to get rid of it. But positive value once collected in sufficient quantity, valuable enough that farmers would pay for it. However, using human waste as fertilizer has risks that Romans didn't understand. Those intestinal parasites we discussed, their eggs can survive in feces for extended periods. When you put raw human waste on fields, you can contaminate the crops with parasite eggs. People eat the crops, ingest the eggs, become infected, produce more waste containing more eggs. It's another cycle, like the communal sponges, where Roman practices inadvertently spread disease. Modern studies have tried to track how parasite prevalence varied across the Roman Empire. Based on local agricultural practices, the preliminary findings suggest that areas where human waste was regularly used as fertilizer had higher rates of parasitic infection than areas that relied primarily on animal manure or other fertilizers. The very practices Romans thought were thrifty and efficient waste not were making them sick. Is there a lesson here about sustainability and organic farming? Maybe. The impulse to recycle waste, to return nutrients to the soil rather than simply discarding them, is admirable and probably necessary for long-term agricultural sustainability. The Romans show us that you can do this wrong, that without understanding disease transmission, well-intentioned practices can cause serious harm. Modern organic farming has to deal with these same issues. How do you safely use biological waste products as fertilizer without spreading pathogens? We have better solutions now, like composting at high temperatures to kill parasite eggs and bacteria. But the fundamental problem Romans faced hasn't gone away. Let me tell you about an archaeological excavation that reveals another dimension of Roman bathroom culture. The latrine is a religious space. In Duryopos, a city on the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire, archaeologists excavated a military latrine that had been buried and preserved by desert sand. The facility itself was typical. A room with bench seating, a waste channel, everything we'd expect. But on the walls, they found something unusual: careful drawings and inscriptions invoking gods and spirits for protection. One inscription roughly translates to "May the gods protect this place from evil spirits and demons." There were drawings of protective symbols, names of deities associated with boundaries and thresholds. This wasn't graffiti in the sense of idle doodling. These were carefully executed religious texts and images, created with the intent of sanctifying and protecting the latrine. This wasn't unique to Duryopos. Similar protective inscriptions have been found in latrines across the empire. What they tell us is that Romans genuinely believed their toilets were spiritually dangerous spaces that required divine protection. Remember the goddess Clochina I mentioned earlier? Her cult was more important than I initially indicated. She had temples and shrines, priests who conducted rituals in her honor. There were festivals where she was celebrated. She wasn't a joke or a minor deity. She was taken seriously, venerated, given the respect due to a goddess whose domain was crucial to civilization. Think about what this means. Romans built temples to the goddess of sewers. They conducted religious ceremonies asking for her protection and favor. Priests ritually purified sewage facilities in her name. The elimination of waste wasn't just a practical matter. It was a religious concern. This makes a kind of sense when you think about it. If you believe that certain spaces are thresholds to the underworld, to the realm of spirits and demons, then it makes sense to treat them with religious caution. And what space is more clearly a threshold than a toilet? It's literally a hole into the dark world beneath, a channel through which things pass from the world of the living to the world of decay and death. Roman religious thinking often focused on boundaries and transitions. Janus, the two-faced god, presided over doorways and beginnings. Terminus governed boundary stones. Cardia protected door hinges. It is consistent with this pattern that there would be a deity associated with the boundary between clean and unclean, between the body and its waste, between the ordered world above and the chaotic underworld below. And it wasn't just protection Romans sought. They also used latrines as places to petition the gods for vengeance or justice. Those depictions I mentioned, cursed tablets, were often thrown into toilets deliberately. The logic seems to have been that by sending your curse into the sewers, you were sending it to the chthonic deities who dwelt in dark, underground places. These gods were often associated with death and vengeance. They weren't the friendly Olympians who protected the city and blessed the harvest. They were older, darker powers that could be petitioned for harsher blessings. Hundreds of these cursed tablets have been recovered from Roman sewers. They were usually thin sheets of lead inscribed with the target's name and the specific harm the cursor wanted them to suffer. The language is often formulaic, following patterns that suggest there were professional curse makers who would write them for you, if you couldn't write yourself. Some are astonishingly specific about the suffering they want to inflict. Others are more general, just asking that their enemies suffer misfortune and loss. But the fact that so many were deposited in toilets and sewers tells us something important. Romans associated these spaces with death, with the underworld, with powers that existed outside the normal order of civilization. The toilet wasn't just where you dealt with biological necessity. This standardization was deliberate. Roman military manuals specified exactly how latrines should be constructed, where they should be located, how they should be maintained. This wasn't left to local improvisation. It was engineered, planned, and replicated across thousands of miles. Why did this matter? Because soldiers moved frequently. A legion might be stationed in one place for years, then redeployed to the opposite end of the empire. When they arrived at their new posting, everything was familiar: the layout of the camp, the position of buildings, and yes, the design of the latrines were all standard. This created continuity and comfort in an otherwise unpredictable military life. But it also created something else: a standardized experience of bodily functions. Across the entire Roman military, every soldier, regardless of where they served, had the same bathroom experience. They all sat on the same style of seats, used the same type of sponges, followed the same routines. This might seem trivial, but it's actually a powerful form of cultural control and unity. When even your most intimate bodily functions follow the same pattern as every other soldier in the empire, you're being shaped into a uniform identity. And when those soldiers retired, they brought the standardization with them. Veterans often settled in colonies near their former postings, and they would build Roman-style facilities in their new communities. They'd teach their children to use communal toilets. They'd introduce locals to Roman bathroom culture. The military was a vector for spreading Roman practices throughout the empire, and bathroom habits were part of what spread. In frontier regions, where Roman culture met and mixed with local traditions, the introduction of Roman-style toilets must have been jarring. Imagine being a member of a Germanic tribe in newly conquered territory. Your people have their own bathroom practices, probably more private, probably more makeshift. But yours. Then Romans arrive, build a fort, and construct these communal latrines. They expect you to use them if you want to trade with them, work for them, integrate into their system. Do you adapt? Do you maintain your own practices? The archaeological evidence suggests that most people eventually adapted, at least partially. Sites that were initially non-Roman show increasing adoption of Roman-style toilet facilities over time as they were integrated into the empire. But this adaptation came at a cost, the cost of abandoning your own cultural practices, of accepting that the Roman way was the civilized way, of teaching your children that what your ancestors did was somehow backward or primitive. This is cultural imperialism operating at the most intimate level. The Romans didn't just conquer territory and extract resources. They colonized bodies and bodily practices. They made people shit the Roman way, and they were often quite explicit about this. Roman writers would comment on how barbarians handled waste, always with a tone of disgust and superiority. Tacitus, writing about Germanic tribes, mentions with distaste that they don't have proper sanitation. The implication is clear. Civilized people use Roman-style toilets, barbarians don't. By adopting Roman bathroom practices, you're proving your civilization, your worthiness to be part of the empire. This might seem like a strange thing to emphasize. Surely the military conquest and political domination were more important than toilet habits. But that's precisely the point. Conquest is obvious. Everyone knows they've been conquered. But cultural colonization is subtler and often more permanent. You can overthrow a military occupation, But it's much harder to overthrow habits and practices you've internalized over generations. If your grandchildren grow up using Roman toilets and thinking that's normal, they're Roman in a way that no amount of military occupation could achieve on its own. The Roman Empire fell in the West in the 5th century CE, but Roman bathroom practices persisted in some form for centuries longer in areas that had been deeply Romanized. The infrastructure fell into disrepair, but the cultural attitudes, the acceptance of communal toileting, the understanding that sanitation requires public infrastructure, the idea that civilization requires managing waste systematically, these persisted. Even when medieval Europeans couldn't or wouldn't maintain Roman-level sanitation systems, they still had the Roman idea that cities should have public facilities. That waste should be channeled away from living spaces, that bathing and waste removal were civic responsibilities. This is the long shadow of Roman bathroom culture. It shaped European attitudes toward sanitation for over a millennium after Rome fell. And in some ways, it still shapes our thinking today. When we build public restrooms, when we design sewage systems, when we think about sanitation as a public health issue, we're following paths that Romans laid down 2,000 years ago. Let me tell you about an aspect of Roman bathroom culture that scholars have only recently begun to study seriously: the graffiti and art found in and around latrines. We've touched on graffiti briefly, but it deserves deeper examination. The walls of Roman toilets were covered with writing and drawings. Hundreds of examples survive from Pompeii alone. It was where you touched the boundary between the civilized world and the realm of dark magic. How did this affect the daily experience of using a latrine? If you believed that demons might rise up through the toilet holes, how comfortable could you be sitting on one? If you knew that cursed tablets were regularly thrown into the waste channels, how safe did you feel? The answer seems to be that Romans developed coping mechanisms: prayers to Clocina, protective amulets, quick visits rather than lingering, but also just accepted it as part of life. The toilet was dangerous, both physically and spiritually, but it was necessary. You did what you had to do and tried not to think too hard about it. Actually, that phrase, "tried not to think too hard about it," might be key to understanding how Romans lived with all the disturbing aspects of their bathroom culture. They normalized it. They developed social rituals and religious protections and practical habits that let them function despite the objective horror of the situation. They didn't dwell on the dangers and indignities, because dwelling on them would have made daily life unbearable. This is a very human response to unavoidable hardship. We see it in every culture, every era. People find ways to cope with terrible conditions by treating them as normal, by developing elaborate frameworks that make the unbearable bearable. Roman bathroom culture is an extreme example, but the psychological mechanism is universal. Now I need to tell you about a discovery that scholars debated for years: evidence of infanticide, an infant exposure connected to latrines in several Roman sites. Archaeologists have found infant skeletons in ancient sewers, particularly in sewers connected to bathhouses and brothels. The numbers are disturbing. At one site in Britain, over 100 infant skeletons were recovered from a single sewer. The question is, how did they get there? The grim answer appears to be that unwanted infants were sometimes disposed of through toilets and waste channels. Roman law technically prohibited infanticide, but infant exposure, abandoning unwanted babies in public places where they might be picked up by slavers or die of exposure, was common and legal. For babies who died shortly after birth, or for desperate women who couldn't or wouldn't expose an infant publicly, the latrine provided a quick, discreet method of disposal. The concentration of infant remains in sewers connected to brothels suggests that prostitutes facing unwanted pregnancy had few options. They couldn't raise children in their circumstances. They couldn't expose infants publicly without revealing their pregnancy, which might have professional and personal consequences. So when they gave birth, they might drop the infant directly into the waste channel, where it would be flushed away into the sewers. This is one of the darkest aspects of Roman bathroom infrastructure. The same channels that Carried away daily waste also carried away dead infants. The same system that Romans were proud of as an engineering achievement became part of a grim social reality where the most vulnerable humans were literally treated as waste. Modern researchers examining these infant remains can often tell stories from the bones. Many show signs of having died at or shortly after birth. Some show evidence of health problems that would have made survival unlikely in any case. But others appear to have been healthy newborns who died because they were unwanted. Their tiny skeletons, recovered from sewer channels, are among the most heartbreaking artifacts of Roman civilization. And here's what makes this even more disturbing. People knew this was happening. It wasn't a secret. Workers who maintained the sewers would have encountered infant remains regularly. Anyone who looked into a latrine waste channel might see evidence. But Roman society accepted it. Unwanted infants were a problem, and the sewer system provided a solution, however grim. This connects to the broader issue of how Roman bathroom infrastructure intersected with the darkest parts of Roman social structure. The toilets and sewers weren't just neutral technology. They enabled and facilitated practices that we now recognize as profound human rights violations. Slavery, prostitution, infanticide, all of these were connected to Roman bathroom culture in various ways. Does this mean we should see Roman sanitation as purely negative? No, that would be too simple. The infrastructure genuinely did solve real problems. It removed visible waste from streets, provided sanitation facilities for millions of people, demonstrated that engineering could address public health concerns, but it also created new problems and enabled terrible practices. Technology is never neutral. Infrastructure always serves someone's interests and reflects someone's values. Let's talk about what happened in the Roman military camps in more detail, because the standardization of latrine facilities across the empire tells us something important about Roman imperial culture. Every Roman military fort, from Britain to Syria, from Spain to Romania, had latrines built to the same basic plan. They were always located in specific positions away from the water supply, downwind from the main camp, but close enough to be convenient for soldiers. The design was standardized: long bench seats, flowing water channels, waste removal systems. A soldier trained in one fort would know exactly how to use the facilities in any other fort. Across the empire, they range from crude drawings to sophisticated poetry, from simple name-calling to elaborate curses, from declarations of love to commercial advertisements. Some examples: Apollinaris, doctor to the emperor, had a shit here. We mentioned this one earlier, but there are so many others. Marcus loves. Spendusa. Lucius Pomponius Maganianus sat here. Phileros is a eunuch. I screwed the barmaid. The variety is endless, and each piece of graffiti tells us something about who used these facilities and what they thought about while there. Poetry appears surprisingly often. Some of it is vulgar, as you'd expect, but some is quite refined. There are quotes from famous poets, original verses, wordplay and puns. Literate Romans passing time in the latrine would entertain themselves, and others by writing on the walls. This tells us that using the toilet wasn't just a quick biological function. People lingered. They spent time there long enough to compose poetry, to create art, to engage in cultural production. The drawings are equally revealing. Pornographic images are common: erect phalluses, couples in various sexual positions, exaggerated genitalia. But there are also drawings of gladiators, gods, ships, animals, architectural features. People drew what they thought about, what they cared about, what entertained them. And then there are the commercial messages, advertisements for brothels, for inns, for businesses of various kinds. The latrine walls served as advertising space. Merchants knew that people spent time in latrines and might read whatever was written there, so they paid someone to paint their advertisements on latrine walls. This suggests that literacy rates among latrine users were fairly high. It would make sense to advertise in writing if your audience could read. But perhaps the most fascinating category of latrine graffiti is the political messages. declarations of support for or against candidates, commentary on current events, critiques of emperors and policies. The latrine, as a public space where people gathered and talked, was also a space for political expression. Think about what this means. In a society where overt political dissent could be dangerous, the latrine provided a semi-anonymous space to express opinions. You could write on the wall under cover of the general bustle and activity, and your message would be read by hundreds of people without anyone knowing for certain who wrote it. The latrine was one of the few truly public spaces in Rome where individual citizens could speak without official oversight. This makes the Roman latrine not just a bathroom, but a kind of proto-democratic space, a place where public opinion could form and be expressed, where people could communicate with each other outside official channels, where the powerless could have a voice, even if only written on a wall, of course. This also means that Roman authorities monitored latrines. There's evidence that suspicious graffiti would be investigated. If someone wrote something treasonous or blasphemous, there might be consequences. But the sheer volume of graffiti and the fact that new messages appeared daily meant that surveillance could never be complete. The latrine walls remained a space for relatively free expression. Modern graffiti studies have analyzed the content and distribution of Roman latrine graffiti to understand social networks and cultural patterns. Who wrote what where? What topics dominated in different neighborhoods? How did graffiti in wealthy areas differ from graffiti in poor areas? The findings are fascinating. Wealthy neighborhoods tended to have more literary graffiti poetry, quotations, clever wordplay. Poor neighborhoods had more direct messages, declarations, insults, commercial advertisements. Military latrines had lots of graffiti about specific military units, pride and legion identity, hostile messages about rival units. This makes sense. Graffiti reflects the concerns and culture of its writers. But it also shows that Roman bathroom culture wasn't monolithic. The experience of using a latrine in a wealthy neighborhood was different from using one in a poor neighborhood, and not just in terms of physical quality. The social and cultural atmosphere was different too. Here's a specific example that brings this to life. In one latrine in Pompeii, archaeologists found a series of connected graffiti messages that appear to be a conversation. Someone wrote successes, love Severa. Below that, in different handwriting, someone else wrote Severa hates successes. Then a third person added Severus loves successes. Then someone, possibly the original writer, added successes. Get lost. This is remarkable. It's a social drama playing out on a bathroom wall. Multiple people, probably over several days, using graffiti to comment on each other's romantic lives. It's gossipy, mean, funny, and utterly human. These are historical figures. They're not mentioned in any formal text. We know about them only because they and their friends wrote on a latrine wall. But through the graffiti, we can see their social world, their relationships, their humor. This is what makes Roman latrine graffiti so valuable to historians. It gives us access to ordinary people's lives in a way that formal texts never can. No historian bothered to write down what successes felt about Severa, but successes or his friends wrote it on a bathroom wall, and volcanic ash preserved it for 2,000 years. Every piece of graffiti is a voice from the past. This probably explains why wealthy Romans preferred private facilities when possible. It wasn't just about comfort or status. It was about safety. A private latrine in your home, used only by your family and household slaves, was safer than a public latrine where you sat next to strangers who might have any intention. But most Romans didn't have that option. They had to use public facilities and accept the risks. How did they manage? Probably by going in groups when possible, by avoiding latrines at night or in isolated locations, by staying alert even in this most vulnerable position, by developing a kind of latrine street smarts, knowing which facilities were safe, which times were dangerous, how to position yourself to see potential threats. The violence wasn't always physical assault. There's also evidence of theft in latrines. People would leave their clothes and belongings on hooks or benches while they used the facilities. Remember, you needed your hands free to manipulate the tersorium, and these items might be stolen. This was apparently common enough that there were special curses for it. Several depictions specifically called down vengeance on people who stole from the latrine. Imagine losing your clothes while using a public toilet. You're sitting there, half naked by necessity, and someone grabs your tunic and runs. Now you have to leave the latrine without your clothes, or stay there hoping someone will help you. It's humiliating and potentially dangerous, yet it happened often enough that people develop specific magical protections against it. All of this paints a picture of Roman latrines as spaces of multiple vulnerabilities. You were physically vulnerable, sitting in an exposed position with your clothes displaced. You were socially vulnerable, on display to strangers in an intimate moment. You were vulnerable to disease through the shared sponges and contaminated surfaces. You were spiritually vulnerable in a space believed to be haunted by demons. And you were vulnerable to violence and theft from other users. And yet people use these facilities daily. They had no choice. The biological necessity overrode all the dangers and indignities. This is what is so profoundly revealing about bathroom culture. It shows us what people will endure when they have to, what they'll normalize when there's no alternative. Let us shift our focus to a different but related topic: how seasonal changes affected Roman bathroom experiences. In winter, using a latrine would have been genuinely unpleasant. Those marble seats were stone cold. The running water, even if sourced from heated baths, would have lost much of its warmth by the time it reached the latrine channels. The rooms themselves, despite having some passive heating from body heat and possibly hypocaust systems, would have been chilly. This is where the sea-warming slaves become more understandable. It wasn't just decadent luxury. In genuinely cold weather, a marble seat could be painful to sit on. It would shock your system, tense your muscles, make the whole process more difficult. A warm seat was a genuine comfort, even if the method of warming it was morally abhorrent. But what about poor people who didn't have sea-warming slaves? They just endured the cold. They sat on frozen stone and dealt with it. Or they avoided using latrines when possible in winter, relying instead on chamber pots that they could use in the relative warmth of their rooms. Even though this meant dealing with the waste disposal problem later, summer brought different challenges. The heat would have made latrines smell worse as bacteria multiplied faster and waste decomposed more quickly. The flowing water helped, but couldn't completely eliminate the odor. And in hot weather, latrines would have been breeding grounds for flies and other insects. There's evidence that Romans used perfumes and incense in latrines to mask odors. Especially in summer, wealthy households might have slaves whose job included burning incense in the latrine before and during use. Public facilities might have had incense burning continuously in summer months. This created a strange olfactory experience, the smell of waste mixing with the smell of perfume, neither quite overwhelming the other. The flowing water in latrine channels would have also presented seasonal challenges. In winter, if temperatures dropped below freezing, which they did in northern parts of the empire, the water channels might freeze. A specific human being, at a specific moment, chose to write or draw something on a wall. They probably didn't think anyone would care about it 2,000 years later. They were just passing time, expressing themselves, communicating with their immediate community. But they left us a window into their world. And here's something that should make you think. We do the same thing now. We write on bathroom walls. We leave messages for strangers. We express ourselves in these semi-public, semi-private spaces. 2,000 years from now, if any of our bathroom graffiti survives, what will it tell people about us? What will they learn about our loves and hates, our politics and humor, our culture and concerns? Bathroom graffiti is an unbroken tradition from ancient Rome to the present. The medium changes: carved stone versus magic marker, but the impulse is the same. The desire to leave a mark, to communicate, to be known, to participate in the social life of these strange public-private spaces. Now let us discuss something truly disturbing that emerged from recent archaeological research. Evidence of violence in Roman latrines. I mentioned earlier that latrines could be dangerous spaces where assault might occur, but the evidence is even more specific and unsettling than I initially indicated. At several Roman sites, archaeologists have found skeletal remains in or near latrine facilities that show signs of violent trauma. These aren't the infant remains we discussed earlier. These are adult skeletons with injuries consistent with assault or murder. One particularly well-documented case comes from a military fort in Britain. A skeleton was found in a latrine waste channel with severe head trauma. The skull was fractured in a way consistent with being struck multiple times with a heavy object. The position of the body suggested it had been placed in the waste channel deliberately, not fallen there accidentally. Someone was killed, possibly in or near the latrine, and their body was disposed of in the sewage system. This isn't an isolated case. Similar finds have been made at other sites. What they suggest is that latrines, despite being public spaces, were also sites of violence. The reasons vary. Sometimes it might have been robbery, someone attacked while vulnerable. Sometimes it might have been interpersonal violence, a fight that turned lethal. Sometimes it might have been murder, with the latrine chosen as a disposal site because bodies could be easily hidden in the waste channels. Think about what this means for the daily experience of using a Roman latrine. You're not just worried about disease, about the indignity of public defecation, about the spiritual dangers. You're also aware that violence can happen here, that someone might attack you while you're literally sitting on the toilet, unable to flee, unable to defend yourself effectively. Women and children would have been particularly vulnerable. A woman using a latrine alone might be targeted for assault. Children might be abducted or harmed. The very openness of these spaces that made them social hubs also made them dangerous for vulnerable populations. This would stop the waste removal system, creating a hygiene crisis. Archaeological evidence suggests that many northern latrines had heating systems, specifically to prevent freezing, but these weren't always reliable. In summer, during droughts, water flow might be reduced as aqueduct supplies dwindled and priority went to drinking water and the public baths. Slower flowing water meant less effective waste removal, more smell, more disease risk. Some latrines might have had to close temporarily during severe droughts simply because there wasn't enough water to operate them. This seasonal variation would have shaped how people used latrines throughout the year. In the dead of winter or the height of summer, you'd use public facilities only when necessary. Spring and fall, with their moderate temperatures and reliable water flow, would have been the pleasant seasons for latrine use, if such a thing can be called pleasant. Can you imagine planning your bathroom use around the seasons, timing your bowel movements to avoid the worst weather? Modern people with indoor plumbing never have to think about this. But for Romans, bathroom use was always mediated by environmental conditions, always subject to seasonal constraints. Let's talk about disease outbreaks and how they related to Roman bathroom infrastructure. We've discussed chronic parasitic infections, but what about acute disease outbreaks? Rome suffered periodic epidemics that killed thousands. The Antonini Plague in the 2nd century CE, the Plague of Cyprian in the 3rd century. These massive disease events swept through the empire, and bathroom practices likely played a role in their transmission. Modern analysis of ancient pandemic descriptions suggests that at least some of these diseases spread through fecal contamination. Typhoid fever, for instance, spreads when people ingest food or water contaminated with the feces of infected individuals. In a city where sewage emptied into the river that people use for water during emergencies, where contaminated water might back up into public fountains during floods, where communal toilet sponges spread fecal matter from person to person, typhoid would have found ideal conditions. During an epidemic, public latrines would have become death traps. Every infected person using a latrine would leave traces of the pathogen on the communal sponges, on the seats, in the waste channels. Every subsequent user would be exposed. The very gathering places that normally serve social functions would become vectors for mass infection. Did Romans recognize this? Did they avoid public latrines during epidemics? The sources are mostly silent on this question. We know that during severe plagues, many normal social activities stopped, markets closed, public gatherings were prohibited. But whether people avoided latrines specifically isn't clearly documented. However, we can infer that the wealthy would have been better protected. They could use private facilities and avoid exposure to the masses of infected poor. The poor, with no option but public latrines, would have been devastated. This might explain the class patterns of survival that we see in some ancient epidemics, the rich surviving at much higher rates than the poor, not just because of better nutrition and medical care, but because they could isolate themselves from the infrastructure that spread disease. This raises an uncomfortable question about Roman sanitation generally. We've established that it spread some diseases while preventing others. But did it, on net, make Romans healthier or sicker? The answer probably varies by class. For the wealthy, Roman sanitation likely was beneficial. They got the advantages of clean water and waste removal, without most of the disadvantages of shared facilities. For the poor, it's less clear. The infrastructure they relied on gave them access to water and toilets, which was better than nothing. But it also exposed them to parasites and epidemic diseases in ways that might have made them worse off than in simpler, less connected communities. This is another lesson about infrastructure and inequality. The same systems affected different populations in radically different ways. The toilet facilities that preserved the health of the rich sickened the poor, not because of any intentional malice, but because of how the infrastructure was designed and who had access to alternatives. Now I want to discuss a topic that ancient sources barely mention, but that must have been significant: menstruation and how it was managed in Roman bathroom culture. Women menstruated then as now, and they had to deal with it somehow. Roman sources are frustratingly vague about this, discussing women as bodily functions in detail wasn't considered appropriate in formal writing, but from scattered references and archaeological evidence, we can piece together some information. Roman women used cloth pads, probably held in place by some kind of undergarment or belt. These would need to be washed regularly, creating a challenge in households without private facilities. Where do you wash menstrual cloths in a society where most people share water sources? Probably in private, at home, using water brought from public fountains. But the actual changing of pads, the management of menstruation while out in public, this must have been challenging. Public latrines didn't offer privacy for women to change pads discreetly. The communal nature of the facilities meant that everyone could see what you were doing. How did women handle this? We don't know for certain. Possibly they used the latrine stalls that existed in some larger bath complexes, which offered more privacy than the standard open bench design. Possibly they timed their outings to avoid needing to change pads in public. Possibly they just accepted that this, like everything else about elimination, was public and visible. There's also the question of how menstruation was viewed in the context of latrine use. Many ancient cultures considered menstruation unclean or spiritually dangerous. Romans seem to have held some of these views. Pliny the Elder writes about the supposedly magical and dangerous properties of menstrual blood. Did this create restrictions on women using latrines while menstruating? Were menstruating women prohibited from certain facilities or relegated to specific areas? The sources don't tell us, which might mean either that such restrictions didn't exist or that they were so normal they did need to be mentioned. Either way, it's another dimension of how gender shaped the experience of Roman bathroom culture. Men and women both used communal toilets, but their experiences weren't identical. Women had to manage biological functions that men didn't, in spaces that offered no accommodation for those functions. This connects to a broader point about how Roman bathroom culture reflects Roman gender relations. The toilets, like most public spaces in Rome, were designed primarily with male users in mind. Women's specific needs were afterthoughts at best. This isn't unique to Rome. Most cultures throughout history have designed public infrastructure primarily for men, but it is worth noting how bathroom culture perpetuated and reinforced gender inequality. Let me tell you about an unusual archaeological finding that illuminates how Romans thought about childhood and toilet training. At several Roman sites, archaeologists have found small ceramic or wooden seats that fit inside the holes of larger toilet seats. These were children's inserts, designed to allow small children to use adult-sized toilet facilities safely. A child using a regular Roman toilet seat would risk falling through the hole into the waste channel below. The holes were often quite large. These inserts prevented that while allowing children to use the same facilities as adults. The existence of these inserts tells us several things. First, that Romans did think about child safety in bathroom design. Second, that children were expected to use communal facilities from a fairly young age if they stayed home. Until they were large enough for adult seats, the inserts wouldn't have been necessary. Third, that toilet training in Rome meant not just learning to control your bodily functions, but learning to do so in public, in communal facilities, following all the social rules that adults followed. Can you imagine toilet training a toddler in a Roman latrine? You take them to this crowded public space, help them onto the seat or the insert, teach them to use the tersorium, show them how to rinse it for the next person, all while surrounded by strangers. All while your child is fully visible and exposed. If they had accidents, and toddlers always have accidents during training, everyone would see. If they struggled or cried or refused, it would be a public spectacle. Modern parents complain about the challenges of toilet training, but at least they can do it in the privacy of their own bathrooms, with doors they can lock, with time to be patient and gentle. Roman parents had none of those luxuries. Toilet training was necessarily a public process. One more way that Roman childhood was fundamentally different from modern childhood. And what did this do to children psychologically? Growing up without any expectation of privacy during elimination. Being trained from toddlerhood that this was a communal activity. This must have shaped their entire understanding of body boundaries and personal space. It's impossible to know exactly how, but it seems likely that Roman children developed a different sense of physical privacy than modern children do. Some psychologists have argued that this might have been healthier in some ways. That modern shame around bodily functions creates neuroses and hang-ups that Romans avoided. But it is equally plausible that the lack of privacy created different kinds of psychological issues that we can't easily recognize from this temporal distance. What we can say is that Roman bathroom culture shaped Romans from their earliest years, creating embodied habits and attitudes that persisted throughout life. You can't unlearn toilet training. The patterns established in childhood, whether you learn to use the bathroom privately or communally, whether you learn to see bodily functions as shameful or normal, stay with you. Roman bathroom culture reproduced itself generationally through the socialization of children. Now let us discuss something truly fascinating: how Roman bathroom culture changed. Over the centuries of Rome's existence, early Rome, before the development of extensive sanitation infrastructure, probably had bathroom practices more similar to other ancient cultures. People would have used private waste pits, chamber pots, and designated outdoor areas. The first public latrines in Rome were probably fairly basic, simple benches over waste pits, without the flowing water and elaborate architecture we associate with later Roman toilets. Over time, as engineering improved and wealth increased, latrines became more sophisticated. The addition of running water, of hypocaust heating, of decorative elements, these came gradually, as Romans experimented with different designs and technologies. But even then, there was variation and innovation. Some later latrines had features we haven't discussed: private stalls in addition to communal benches, separate facilities for men and women. Elaborate decoration programs meant to make the spaces more pleasant. There's evidence that in the later empire, attitudes toward bathroom privacy began shifting. More wealthy homes had truly private latrines, sometimes with doors and locks. Some public facilities began including partitions between seats, offering more privacy. This might reflect changing cultural attitudes influenced by Christianity, which placed more emphasis on modesty and privacy. Or it might just reflect increasing wealth allowing for more elaborate construction. But then, with the fall of the Western Empire in the 5th century, everything changed. The infrastructure collapsed, the aqueducts stopped functioning, the sewers clogged. The public latrines fell into disrepair and were eventually abandoned for centuries. Western Europe lost the sanitation infrastructure that Rome had built. What replaced Roman bathroom culture in medieval Europe was, in many ways, less hygienic and less organized. But it was more private. People used chamber pots and outdoor privies, managing their waste individually or in small family groups rather than communally. Privacy returned, but at the cost of systematic sanitation. It's a strange historical irony. The fall of Rome brought many terrible consequences: economic collapse, political fragmentation, the loss of literacy and learning. But it also brought an end to some of Rome's more disturbing cultural practices. The communal sponges disappeared. The seat-warming slaves were freed or enslaved in other capacities. The public latrines, where disease spread and violence occurred and dignity was daily compromised, crumbled into ruins. Was this progress from a modern perspective, which values both hygiene and privacy? Medieval bathroom practices seem like a step backward in sanitation, but a step forward in human dignity. Romans would have disagreed. They saw their communal facilities as civilized, and medieval private practices as barbaric. Medieval people would have found Roman practices shockingly indecent. The point is that progress isn't linear. Different eras prioritized different values. Rome prioritized systematic waste removal and public infrastructure at the expense of individual privacy. Medieval Europe prioritized privacy at the expense of systematic sanitation. The modern world tries to have both, with varying success, but we can learn from the transitions. The fall of Roman bathroom culture shows us how quickly elaborate infrastructure can collapse if it is not maintained. It shows us how cultural practices that seem permanent and natural can disappear within a generation or two when the circumstances that supported them change. It reminds us that our own bathroom culture, which seems so normal and inevitable to us, is just as contingent and fragile as Rome's was. Let's talk about a question that has fascinated scholars. What did Roman bathrooms sound like? This might seem like an odd thing to wonder about, but sound is a crucial part of the sensory experience of any space. Close your eyes right now and listen to the ambient sounds around you. Those sounds are part of your environment, part of how you experience and understand the space you're in. A Roman latrine would have had a distinctive soundscape, the constant noise of flowing water, of course not the rushing of a modern flush, but a quieter, steadier sound of water moving through channels, the echo of voices, amplified by stone walls and marble surfaces, the sounds of people shifting on seats, of clothing being adjusted, of the tersorium being swished in the cleaning channel, and yes, the sounds of bodily functions, flatulence, defecation, urination, all happening openly, all audible to everyone in the room. These sounds that we instinctively try to hide or mask in modern bathrooms were just part of the ambient noise in a Roman latrine. There's an interesting psychological dimension to this. In our modern bathrooms, we try to minimize sound. We run the tap to mask the sounds of urination. We flush immediately to eliminate evidence. We're embarrassed if anyone hears us using the bathroom. But Romans had none of this privacy. Everyone heard everyone else. The sounds of elimination were just normal, unremarkable parts of the soundscape. Did this make Romans less embarrassed about bodily functions? Generally, possibly. When you hear dozens of people farting and defecating daily from your earliest childhood, it's hard to maintain the fiction that these functions are shameful or secret. They're just what bodies do, as normal as breathing. But the soundscape would have varied by facility and time of day. An upscale latrine in the morning might have relatively quiet conversation and subdued bodily sounds. As wealthy men conducted business, the same facility in the evening might be rowdier, with more laughter and louder voices. A latrine in a poor neighborhood might always be noisy, crowded, and chaotic, and at night, latrines that remained open would have had a completely different sound environment. Fewer voices, more echo, the flowing water more prominent. The sounds of a single person using the facility would echo dramatically in the empty room. This might have been when the spiritual danger of latrines felt most real alone in a large room at night, hearing strange echoes, with darkness pulling in the corners and waste flowing beneath you into the unknown depths. The soundscape also included things we haven't discussed: the sound of attendants cleaning, of maintenance workers repairing channels and seats, of administrators conducting inspections. Latrines weren't just spaces for users, they were workplaces for the people who maintained them, and their labors would have added to the complex sound environment. What does all this tell us? That Roman bathroom culture was a rich sensory experience, not just a functional necessity. Smell, sound, sight, touch, all these senses were engaged in the daily experience of using a latrine. And that sensory experience shaped how Romans understood their bodies, their society, and their place in both. Now I need to tell you about a recent theory that is controversial, but fascinating. Some scholars have suggested that Roman bathroom culture might have contributed to the spread of new religious ideas, including early Christianity. The argument goes like this: public latrines were spaces where people from different social classes mixed more freely than in most other public spaces. A slave and a senator might sit next to each other on a latrine bench in a way they never would in the forum or a temple. This created opportunities for conversation and idea transmission across social boundaries. Early Christianity, like other religious movements of the time, spread partly through person-to-person contact. Someone would hear about the new faith, find it compelling, and tell others. These conversations could happen anywhere, but public spaces where people gathered and had time to talk were particularly important. And latrines, where people spent significant time in close proximity, were ideal for such conversations. There's very limited direct evidence for this theory early Christian sources don't usually mention where conversions happen, and certainly don't emphasize if it was in latrines. But there's some suggestive evidence. Graffiti in Roman latrines includes early Christian symbols and messages. The fish symbol, the Cairo, references to Christ. These appear in latrine graffiti from the 3rd and 4th centuries. This could just mean that Christians use latrines and sometimes express their faith there. But it might mean more. It might mean that latrines were spaces where Christian ideas circulated, where believers could discuss their faith somewhat away from official oversight, where the boundaries between social classes were porous enough that messages could spread. The theory is speculative, but it points to something important. Roman bathroom culture created specific social dynamics and opportunities that might have had unexpected consequences. The communal nature of latrines, their role as gathering spaces, the conversations that happened there, all of this was part of the social infrastructure of the Roman world, shaping everything from business to politics to religion. Let me tell you about the strangest artifact I've encountered in researching Roman bathroom culture: a Roman-era portable toilet. In the ruins of a wealthy villa, archaeologists found a bronze chair with a hole in the seat and a ceramic pot beneath. This was a personal toilet that could be carried from room to room, set up wherever needed, and used in relative privacy. It wasn't common, only the very wealthy could afford such a thing, but its existence tells us something important. Even in a culture that normalized communal toileting, there was a market for privacy. Some wealthy Romans preferred to defecate in their own rooms, sitting on their portable bronze toilet, rather than using even their private household latrines. This suggests that the acceptance of communal toileting wasn't universal or complete. Some people still wanted privacy, valued it, were willing to pay significant sums for it. This portable toilet also suggests that the sick and elderly might have been accommodated differently. If you were too ill to walk to the latrine, even a private one in your own home. The portable toilet could be brought to you. This hints at a care practice we otherwise know little about: how Romans dealt with people who couldn't use standard facilities. But the very existence of this artifact as a rare, expensive item emphasizes how unusual the desire for privacy was. If only the wealthiest could afford a portable toilet, that means the vast majority of Romans, even fairly wealthy ones, didn't have this option. They used communal or semi-communal facilities their entire lives, and either didn't want more privacy or couldn't afford it. This returns us to a central question. Was the Roman acceptance of communal toileting genuine? Or was it a preference falsification where everyone pretended to accept something they actually disliked because everyone else seemed to accept it? We can't know for certain, but the limited market for privacy, only the extreme wealthy seeking it, and even then not universally, suggests that most Romans truly did accept communal toileting as normal. It wasn't something they longed to escape but couldn't afford. It was just how things were done, how bodies were managed, how daily life unfolded. That makes Roman bathroom culture even more alien to modern sensibilities. We can understand people tolerating unpleasant conditions because they have no choice. That's universal and timeless. But people genuinely accepting, preferring even conditions we find intolerable, that's harder to wrap our minds around. Yet that's what culture does. It shapes preferences, not just behaviors. It makes some things seem desirable and others repugnant in ways that aren't natural or inevitable, but are learned and internalized so deeply that they feel natural. Romans learned to desire, or at least accept, without complaint, communal toileting. We've learned to desire privacy so intensely that we can barely imagine functioning without it. Both are cultural constructions. Neither is more natural than the other. They're just different solutions to the same basic problem of managing human waste. Now, as we begin to approach the end of this exploration, I want to discuss what happened to Roman latrines after they were abandoned. How the physical ruins have been interpreted and reinterpreted by later cultures. In medieval times, ruined Roman latrines were sometimes repurposed. The stone would be scavenged for other building projects. The spaces might become storage areas, animal pens, or dumping grounds. The elaborate waste channels were often used as convenient ditches for medieval waste, though without the flowing water that had made them functional. But sometimes, the ruins were viewed with awe. Medieval Europeans, who encountered intact Roman latrines with their marble seats and sophisticated channels, saw them as evidence of Roman engineering genius. They didn't necessarily understand the communal nature of the facility's medieval sensibilities, made that hard to comprehend, but they recognized sophisticated infrastructure. Renaissance scholars, rediscovering classical texts that mentioned Roman baths and latrines, began to study the ruins more systematically. They tried to understand how the systems had worked to reconstruct Roman sanitation infrastructure, but they often misinterpreted what they found, projecting their own assumptions about privacy and propriety onto the Roman past. It wasn't until the 19th century, with the development of modern archaeology and the excavation of sites like Pompeii and Ostia, that scholars really began to understand Roman bathroom culture. And even then, Victorian sensibilities made it difficult to discuss openly. Early archaeological reports often downplayed or omitted details about latrines, considering them too indelicate for polite discussion. The 20th century brought more honest scholarly engagement, but also a tendency towards sensationalism. Roman bathroom practices became a shorthand for Roman decadence and moral decay. Popular histories emphasize the most shocking details: the communal sponges, the seat-warming slaves, while ignoring the mundane realities of daily life. Now, in the 21st century, we're trying to understand Roman bathroom culture more holistically, to see it not as evidence of moral depravity or as a curiosity, but as a window into how a different culture organized daily life around different values and priorities. The physical ruins of Roman latrines still exist throughout Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. You can visit them, Sit on the ancient marble seats, though you probably shouldn't. See the waste channels where water once flowed. These ruins are time machines of a sort. They transport you to a world where bodies and waste were managed completely differently. Some sites have reconstructed latrines, flowing water restored through modern plumbing, giving visitors a sense of what the experience might have been like. Of course, these reconstructions can't fully recreate the ancient experience you're alone or with other tourists, not sitting shoulder to shoulder with Romans. You're using it for a few minutes as an educational experience, not as a daily necessity, but they offer a glimpse, a small taste of what Roman bathroom culture was actually like, and what visitors consistently report as discomfort, even in a clean, safe, reconstructed environment. Sitting on a communal toilet bench feels wrong to modern people. The openness, the lack of privacy, the proximity to others. It triggers every modern instinct about bathroom use. This visceral discomfort is valuable. It shows us, more effectively than any written description, how different Roman culture was from our own. Let us talk about one final aspect of Roman bathroom culture that we need to confront: the question of human dignity and how we judge practices from other times and cultures. When I describe Roman bathroom practices, many people's immediate reaction is horror and disgust. They see the communal sponges, the lack of privacy, the seat-warming slaves, and they conclude that Rome was barbaric, that Romans lived in degrading conditions, that this proves ancient people didn't value human dignity the way we do. But is that fair? Is it right to judge another culture's practices by our standards? Romans would have been equally horrified by many of our practices. The way we isolate our elderly in institutions, the way we treat mental illness, our industrial food production, our environmental destruction, these would seem barbaric to a Roman time traveler. Does that mean we don't value human dignity? The question of judgment is complex. On one hand, some practices genuinely are harmful regardless of cultural context. Slavery is wrong. Using humans as toilet seat warmers is degrading and wrong. We can and should judge these practices, even while acknowledging they were normal in their time. But other aspects of Roman bathroom culture, the communal toileting, the lack of privacy, are harder to judge. They caused harm through disease transmission, which Romans couldn't have known about. But they also created forms of social connection that we've lost. They reflected different values around bodies and privacy that weren't necessarily inferior to ours, just different. I think the most honest position is to say, Roman bathroom culture reveals both the universality and the contingency of human experience. Universal because everyone, in every culture, has to deal with bodily waste somehow. Contingent because the solutions are wildly variable and reflect specific cultural values and material conditions. Romans weren't barbarians or degenerates. They were humans trying to solve human problems with the knowledge and resources they had. They made choices that seem strange to us, but they made sense in their context. And we make choices that would seem strange to them, that might seem barbaric to our descendants. The point of studying Roman bathroom culture isn't to feel superior or to judge, but to understand, to see how culture shapes even our most intimate experiences, to recognize that our own practices aren't natural or inevitable, but are just as constructed as Rome's were. And maybe, if we're really honest, to ask ourselves, what are we getting wrong? What practices that seem normal to us will our descendants look back on with horror? How are we unknowingly creating harm through infrastructure and cultural practices that seem sensible now, but that future people will recognize as destructive? Those are the questions Roman toilets really force us to confront, not questions about the past, but questions about the present and future, not judgments of Romans, but examinations of ourselves. So as we conclude this journey through the grotesque bathroom habits of ancient Rome, I want you to think about what you've learned, not just facts about sponges and sewers, but deeper truths about human nature and culture. You've learned that privacy isn't a universal human need, but a learned value. That infrastructure can solve some problems while creating others. that disease can spread through the very systems designed to prevent it, that humans can normalize almost anything, that dignity means different things in different contexts, that the most intimate aspects of life are shaped by culture and power. You've learned that bathroom culture reveals class structures, gender dynamics, attitudes toward the body, beliefs about cleanliness and contamination, economic systems, religious worldviews, and countless other dimensions of society. The toilet is never just a toilet, it's a window into everything. And you've learned, I hope, to question your own assumptions, to recognize that what seems natural and necessary to you is actually constructed and contingent, to wonder what future people will think of your bathroom habits, to be humble about judging the past, because the future will surely judge you. The marble benches of Roman latrines are cold and silent. Now, the water channels are dry. The communal sponges have long since rotted away. But the questions remain. The challenges remain. The fundamental human problem of what to do with our waste. How to manage our bodies. How to preserve dignity. While meeting biological needs, these haven't changed. We've just found different answers than Romans did. Answers that seem obvious and right to us, that Romans would have found bizarre and wrong. Answers that our descendants might judge as harshly as we judge Roman practices. The wheel turns. Civilizations rise and fall. Bathroom cultures change. But underneath it all, we're still just humans. Animals with aspiration to something more, trying to navigate the gap between what we are and what we want to be. Romans built an empire that lasted 1,000 years. They created law, literature, art, and architecture that still influences us today. They engineered infrastructure that we study and admire. They shaped Western civilization in countless ways. And they did all of it while sitting shoulder to shoulder in communal toilets, sharing dirty sponges, spreading diseases they couldn't see, treating their most vulnerable members with casual cruelty that they saw as completely normal. That's the full truth of Rome. The glory and the grotesquerie, the achievement and the horror, the marble temples and the marble toilet seats. All of it together, inseparable, part of the same civilization, the same culture, the same humanity. And that's the full truth of us too. We build skyscrapers and spacecraft while creating environmental catastrophes we'll leave for our children to clean up. We cure diseases while creating new health crises through our lifestyle choices. We celebrate human rights while participating in systems of exploitation. We're no more consistent, no more purely good or bad than Romans were. The bathroom, that humble, necessary space, reveals this truth more clearly than any temple or palace ever could. Because in the bathroom, we can't hide. We can't pretend to be more than we are. We're just bodies, dealing with the consequences of being bodies. Trying to do it with some measure of dignity and grace. Romans tried. They built sophisticated infrastructure and elaborate cultural practices around this fundamental need. They succeeded in some ways and failed in others. Their solutions were imperfect, sometimes harmful, often strange. But so are ours. So will be our descendants. The search for the perfect bathroom culture, the system that's hygienic and dignified, private and communal, sustainable and comfortable, accessible to all and offensive to none continues. Rome's attempt ended 2,000 years ago. Ours continues. Our children's children will try their own solutions, and through it all, the basic truth remains. We're human. We create waste. We need to manage it. How we do so says everything about who we are. That's what the grotesque bathroom habits of ancient Rome teach us. Not just about Rome, but about ourselves. Not just about the past, but about the present and future. Not just about toilets, but about civilization itself. The next time you close your bathroom door and lock it behind you, think for just a moment about the Romans, about the fact that this privacy you take for granted didn't exist for them, about the fact that your disgust at their practices is learned, not natural, about the fact that 2,000 years from now, people might feel the same visceral revulsion at your bathroom habits that you feel at Roman ones, and then, maybe, Feel a little less certain that you have it all figured out. A little more humble about judging the past. A little more curious about what we're missing, what we're getting wrong, what invisible harms we're causing while thinking we're civilized. Because that's what studying history is really for. Not to make us feel superior to people who came before, but to make us wiser about how we live now. Not to judge the past, but to learn from it. Not to mock Roman toilet practices, but to understand what they reveal about the human condition theirs and ours. The marble seats are empty now. The water has stopped flowing. The last Roman who sat on those benches died 1600 years ago. But the questions they faced, the challenges they grappled with, the gap between their aspiration and their reality, these are timeless. We face them still. We always will. That's the real lesson of Rome's grotesque bathroom habits. That's what makes them worth studying, worth understanding, worth sitting with despite the discomfort they cause. We're all Romans in the end, building civilizations on imperfect solutions to universal problems, trying our best and getting it partly wrong, creating infrastructure that helps and harms in ways we can't fully predict, shaping culture while being shaped by it. And someday, distant descendants will excavate our bathrooms, study our waste systems, read our messages written on bathroom walls, and wonder how we could have lived the way we did, how we could have accepted practices that seemed so obviously wrong to them, how we could have thought we were civilized while perpetuating such barbarism. And they'll be right, just as we're right about Rome, just as our descendants will be right about them. The cycle continues, the wheel turns, the search for better answers goes on, and in the end, we're all just sitting in that latrine, shoulder to shoulder with every human who came before, and everyone who will come after, sharing the same fundamental needs, making different choices, leaving behind ruins for others to interpret and judge. That's humanity. That's civilization. That's what Roman toilets teach us. Everything else is just details.